miniaturize a nuclear weapon and put it on an ICBM. I'm not aware that that assessment has changed, and some of the administration, the intelligence community officials that I'd spoken to today were not aware that that assessment has changed. If it has changed, it's something that will come from the intelligence community. With regard to the President-elect's tweets, I'll let his team explain exactly what he means.
Thanks, Josh.
Okay, Margaret.
Thank you, Josh. I appreciate it. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you.
Thanks. So I'm just wondering whether you've spoken with President Obama about the possibility of slapping a tariff on cars made in Mexico and imported into the U.S., and what you think the impacts of that would be on foreign policy or the economy.
I've not spoken to President Obama about that. I know that that is contrary to the approach that President Obama has taken when it comes to trying to manage our trade relationships around the world. In fact, the President was strongly supportive of a Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement that his administration negotiated that included Mexico, that would have raised labor standards, raised environmental standards, would have protected intellectual property, and would have made it easier and fairer for U.S. businesses that are competing against Mexican businesses. That would have been good for the U.S. economy. That would have been good for U.S. workers. It would have been good for U.S. businesses. The incoming president does not seem to share that view, and he believes in a different approach. And many economists have expressed concerns about how the imposition of tariffs, like some have suggested, would actually have a starkly negative impact on the economy, because it would not just result in higher prices being paid by American customers. It means that American goods that are shipped overseas face a similar retaliatory tariff. And since we're not starting out on a level playing field, even if the tariff is equal in stature to the tariff that's imposed by the United States, it will have a disproportionate negative impact on those American products. So many economists have made the argument that imposing a tariff like that is actually the worst of both worlds when it comes to the interests of the United States, our consumers, our workers, and our economy. So that's why the president has tried a much different approach. But ultimately, the next administration will have to pursue the strategy that they believe is the best, and we'll have an opportunity to evaluate what works best. The president has a very strong track record when you consider the performance of the U.S. economy under his leadership, under the economic strategy that he has put together. But the incoming president was elected on a promise to try things different, to try different things and to do things differently. And we'll have an opportunity to evaluate how well it works.
I just wanted to follow up quickly. Do you know whether President Obama has spoken with the president of Mexico today, perhaps?
No, I'm not aware that they've spoken today.
And the kind of flip side to the president-elect's Twitter-related actions on car policy, I guess, is that Ford Motor Company has announced that they've canceled this major expansion into Mexico and are going to preserve some jobs in the U.S. Would you say that that's good news, and would you applaud President-elect Trump for his actions on that, or do you know enough about it to comment on it?
Well, I've read some of the news coverage of this. I've not been in touch with either the transition team or the Ford about their announcement. But I read in published reports about their announcement that it was not tied to any political considerations. And I noted that over the last 5 years or so that Ford has actually increased the number of workers at their company by about 28,000. So this is only the latest step in a long-running, significant, and positive trend for the U.S. economy that those jobs are being protected. So that's obviously good news. Okay, John.
Josh, 28,000 domestic.
Yeah, we can look up the numbers for you. We'll follow up.
Josh, on the measures taken against Russia, why was Vladimir Putin not mentioned as one of those sanctions? Is that an indication that you didn't have evidence that the Russian leader was responsible for this, or directed this, or approved it?
Not necessarily, John. The intelligence community has indicated their view that given the significance of the actions that Russia carried out against the United States, their conclusion is that this is something that had to have been directed at the highest levels of the Russian government.
So why not hit the president? the guy responsible?
Well, as you know, that typically with regard to sanctions policy, that there are only certain circumstances in which the leader of the country is personally named. I can't get into all the. There's no denying that this is a significant action. So what I would say is just that it would be rather extraordinary if Mr. Putin himself were among the people who were listed. But I can't speak to the decisions that were made by the experts at the Treasury Department about who was named and who was not.
So when the Chinese hacked OPM in 2015, 21+ million current and former government employees and contractors had their personal records stolen by the Chinese. Why did the White House do nothing publicly in reaction to that hack, which in some ways was even more widespread than what we saw here from the Russians?
Well, I think that what we've seen is that these are two cyber incidents that are malicious in nature, but materially different.
21 million people had their personal data taken, fingerprints, social security numbers, background checks.
Yeah.
I mean, this was a far-reaching.
I'm not downplaying the significance of it. I'm just saying that it's different than seeking to interfere in the conduct of a U.S. national election. I can't speak to the steps that have been taken by the United States in response to that Chinese malicious cyber activity.
But nothing was announced. There was not a single step announced by the White House in response to that.
That is true that there was no public announcement about our response, but I can't speak to what response may have been initiated in private.
But no diplomats expelled, no compounds shut down, no sanctions imposed, correct?
Well, again, I can't speak to...
You don't do that stuff secretly. I mean, that's...
Well, certainly when it comes to the diplomats, that's right. There are no diplomats at P&G. That's something that we would announce publicly. But look, I can't speak to the response because, as you pointed out, that's not something that we have announced. It certainly is something that we take seriously. It's certainly that the president has raised directly with his Chinese counterpart, and we certainly have seen commitments from the Chinese with regard to some norms in cyberspace that we would like to see them observe. For example, we did see the Chinese president commit in the Rose Garden in the fall of 2015 that Russia would, or that China would not be engaged in the kind of cyber-enabled theft for commercial gain that's sponsored by national governments. So that represents some progress, and that does represent the protection of U.S. Commercial interests here in the United States, and that certainly is an important step, an important part of establishing some of these rules of the road that will allow the international community to resolve how to limit the malicious behavior of some actors in cyberspace.
But you see how there's just this widely different response. I mean, with the Russians, which of course is very politically charged, the White House takes this action, makes it public. With the Chinese, which was not so politically charged, but was absolutely as far-reaching a hack as we had ever seen in this country, nothing.
At least of the government. At least of the government, right? That there are ample examples of other malicious cyber actors in the private sector.
The response to that OPM hack,
exploiting personally identifiable information and engaging in other wide-reaching malicious cyber activity. But look, I'm not suggesting that somehow that's not important. What I'm just saying is that it's materially different than the kind of hack and leak strategy that we saw the Russians engage in to try to influence our democracy. That is significant. That's serious, and that explains the serious steps that that President Obama has imposed against the Russians in response. But with regard to the Chinese, we have made some progress with them in trying to limit the kind of malicious cyber activity that could threaten U.S. interests, either in the United States or around the world, in our government or in the private sector. And we're pleased with some of the progress that we've made, but there's no denying that the next administration will assume a significant burden in trying to craft a policy in cyberspace that effectively stands up to our adversaries and looks out for the interests of the American people.
Okay, and just one other quick, Sean Spicer, I think this is your first briefing since he was announced as the incoming press secretary for the President Trump.
It is.
Any advice to Sean on how to conduct this job?
Well, listen, I had an opportunity to congratulate Sean via email shortly after the announcement.